أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمخلوقين سيدنا ونبينا وشفينا أبي القاسم محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم أما بعد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Salawat. Sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum. We want to continue our discourse from yesterday. I know that some of the issues which we are dealing with are a little bit more entangled and difficult. But unfortunately, there is not very much we can do without getting to grips with some of these issues, particularly the intricacies between the Akhbari and Usuli schools, because these determine the kind of polemic which have been generated over the ages. These determine the kind of permissible governance in societies, and these determine the kind of resources one can use. Unfortunately, that is not possible to say one side is categorically right over the other. There are lots of issues which need to be looked at. But we will deal with them as we look at certain issues which we want to deal today. Yesterday we reached the point of the sort of disintegration of the Safavid Empire and the rise of Nadir Shah in Iran with the help of with the collaboration of the Afghan invaders, and therefore that brought an element of Shi'i-Sunni blend in the discourse, as I showed you, that he stopped the cursing of the caliphs, and he also tried to get Jafari fiqh accepted as a fifth acceptable fiqh. In this period, the Safavi period, apart from what happened in Iran, of course, Iran became a consolidated state, albeit now a predominantly Imami state from a predominantly Sunni state before. It also led this 400 years, 300 years, led to a lot of flourishing of trade and commerce from that part, because obviously it's a rich, resource-wise, quite a rich country. There was no oil at that time, but other resources were there. Most of the trading from that side, still today you can see a lot of trading between Iran and countries on the other side of the Persian Gulf and Iraq, which was there, but which was small at that time. The big trade was with the western coast of India. So you could literally sail from southern ports in Iran to the western coasts of India. So during that period, there was a lot of commercial traffic between Iran and India, and a lot of Persian traders and their families and people who came with them settled in the western coast of India, to the extent that 3 or 4 parts became small, if you like, Shi'i-dominated regions, the western coast of India, including Hyderabad, Golconda, and a number of places like that. And large number of Iranians plus local converts and associates began to propagate the religion of Ahlul Bayt there. A lot of those who settled were, in many senses, also exiles from the Safavi state. They had sort of fallen into disagreements of one kind or another and so many other things. But they were very skilled and very useful people. So a lot of them started to get absorbed into the Mughal bureaucracy in different parts of the country. However, the Safavi baggage of extreme sectarian discourse was shipped to India with these people. We had lots of reports of all kinds of extreme behavior in that place. And as many of you may know, most of the Mughal emperors were not Shi'i. And some of them were not well disposed to Shi'ism as well. Some of them were neutral. Some of them used some of these traders and other officials and notables for their own purposes by allowing small concessions here and there. But overall, if you see, they were not well disposed. So during the Mughal times, we had the spread of very small pockets of Shi'ism in India, mostly on the west coast. But as I said, the primary discourse was still very toxic in terms of sectarian content. And the main thrust of the key dispute between the Umayyads and Imam Hussein, or Umayyads and Imam Ali, and then followed up to Imam Hussein alayhi salam, was lost. It transferred itself into earlier times and into other areas which were not relevant to this discussion. And many times, and this is continued to today, you can see that many times processions in Muharram for the commemoration of the events of Kerbala resulted in violence, not because of the processions, but because they contained content in terms of chants which were derogatory to the other caliphs, not to the Umayyads necessarily, more. And to this day, you have this problem in both India and Pakistan, where these processions still contain that. But the origin is in that migration. However, as the Mughal Empire slowly started to weaken with pressures from the Afghans on the north, the British East India Company, and all kinds of other invaders, most of these people in the west coast of India, the Shi'i pockets, were dispersed across the country. Small pockets remained in Hyderabad to this day, but otherwise they were dispersed. But in Bengal, a small Shi'i dynasty came to power through one of them, which lasted about 50 years but didn't then last longer. But south of Bengal, between Delhi and Bengal, there is what is now mostly known as UP or Uttar Pradesh. There were the states of Awadh, where a Shi'i Nawab came to power in a predominantly Sunni polity. And they started to look for people to teach them. They wanted to spread Shi'ism, so they started to look for people who would, Imami scholars who could teach. They didn't find many. They found, because most of the earlier Shi'i communities had relied on people like me who were not scholars but just dabbled into these things, and they said, can you read this and can you read that? So that's not like a very solid basis for teaching. So ultimately, they decided that probably it was best if they could send a number of key students to Najaf and Karbala to study. Now, before this movement of students, you can imagine that in a majority Sunni community, the Shias had found a way of coexistence. And a number of them were inclined towards akhbarism in terms of the idea that, look, we don't need to condemn the other Khulafa or anything. We need to just talk about Muawiyah and later. But as I said, the Safavi idea of more polemics was gaining ground, but it was still not strong enough to make an impact. However, when these students, some of them were actually akhbari oriented, started to go to Najaf and Karbala, as we saw yesterday, by that time, with the collapse of the Safavids and the rise of Nadir Shah and so on, a lot of the leading ulama from Iran decided to go and stay in Najaf and Karbala, especially Karbala. And so the change led by somebody like Bahbahani advanced the Usuli cause in Karbala. So it had already absorbed that kind of thinking. So these people like Nasir Abadi and so on from Awadh, when they went to Najaf and Karbala and returned back, they returned as strong Usulis with this additional baggage of a very toxic sectarian discourse. And it started to spread, obviously, with the patronage of the Nawabs. Became quite possible to spread this madhab and to establish seminaries and schools and things. In fact, they started to rival some of the major Sunni seminaries. So one of the big, well-known seminaries, for example, in that part is called the Farangi Mahal. Farangi Mahal is the most famous place there. And its compilation called the Fatwa Alamgiri is one of the classic works compilation of Hanafi fiqh for that time. So it was quite a significant and substantial place. It had also absorbed a dose of Mu'tazilism. So part of its teaching was rational and thinking based on reason. So it had some elementary scientific curriculum and all kinds of things. So it was important. But these people also managed to set up something which rivaled. Clearly, Usulism was favored by the Nawabs because it allowed the legitimacy of the regime and the Jummah prayer to be led in the name of the Nawab. Just like in the Safavi times, the scholars had allowed the Jummah in Iran to be led in the name of the Safavi Shah. And so this was preferred, and slowly the idea of concentration in one leading mujtahid or a couple of leading mujtahids, allowing this legitimacy to the state, was also promoted. However, what was not yet fixed was that they were still not able or willing or allowed, I don't know which, is difficult to surmise, to collect religious taxes. These were still to be sent to their senior teachers in Iraq. So large amounts of money in the late 18th century onwards started to go to Najaf and Karbala for the upkeep of the shrines, and we will see other things which proved quite fortuitous. And contrary to today's time, when we have mostly knowledge of khums going to the mujtahids, there were about 5 different categories of religious dues which people used to send. So, one is khums with the 2 portions, semi Imam and semi Sadat, which the Usuli ulama had already rationalized that the portion of the Imam could be used by them for the benefit of the community. You don't need to bury it in the ground or do anything, you can give it to them. The second big one, which is a very interesting one, which we don't see nowadays, is called Radd Mazalim. The payment for removal of zulm which you have committed, or oppression which you have committed, or transgression which you have committed. This was supposed to be paid by everybody who was in government employment, because that was considered to be not permissible. Right? The third one, which we are a little bit familiar, but we don't send it there, is for what we call Sawm and Salat, either for the deceased or those who are not able to pray and fast, and so they, kafara for that. The fourth one was a contribution to the mujtahids for prayers for preventing sickness and danger from affecting the community. Another very interesting one, which I haven't seen recently, is called Haqq al-Wasiyya. That in your bequest, there was said to be a third share of the Maraja in your Wasiyya. Yeah? So you also send that there. And finally, there was a non-obligatory addition, which was for maintaining the distribution of water in Kerbala to the Zawars. So you can see there is quite a large category of taxes or dues or contributions which could go there. And because, as we said, post-Safavis, especially Nadir Shah, he removed all the endowments, stipends, benefits which were granted to the scholars in Safavi times. So now they became quite dependent on these contributions in terms of maintaining the houses, the madrasas, whatever they are. And so the people who sent this money became quite influential in dictating what was happening, which we will see tomorrow a little bit, but I'm just giving you a background here. And in Iraq of that time, there wasn't that large a Shi'i community. It was mostly parts of Baghdad, Kufa, Najaf, Karbala, and Hilla, and then bits and pieces here and there. And also in Iraq, even until recently, there isn't a tradition of the commercial elites, Shi'i commercial elites, paying these taxes to the Maharaja. It's very much less than Iran. Iran developed, and the Iranian ulama who migrated to these places could still rely on monies coming from there. There's one more interesting source of revenue, which we would not think. And that was this belief. Again, you will see how beliefs change over time, right? That if you can, you should find a way to be buried in Wad Salihin in Najaf. So they started what is called a traffic of corpses. Thousands and thousands of people from Iran and other places being brought for burial, each one, of course, incurring a cost and revenue source to the place. So most of the, and the income of the Hausas at that time from Iran was estimated to be approximately about a third of the whole income of the Qajar state. So you can see the massive amounts. Similar amounts now started to flow from Awadh as the returning students started to send it to their respective teachers. And this also disturbed the balance somewhat in Najaf and Karbala, because these students were mostly attached to Iranian scholars, and so the money started to go to Iranian scholars rather than the Iraqi scholars or the Lebanese scholars or so on. That's for some other time when we will examine the dynamics of Najaf and Karbala. However, so our Shi'i place, as I said, became very much like a Safavid state, both in terms of its conception of governance, sectarian discourse, and toxic, really, condemnation of the caliphs and all kinds of other things, which is there to this day. So that's another legacy which was transferred. When, on the other hand, in Iraq itself, during Safavid times and later, the Ottomans started to take over, and it was nominally under Ottoman rule, Turkish Ottoman rule, which was obviously very strongly Sunni rule. But their reach towards the south of Iraq was not that strong. Occasionally they would go and crack down and then come back. Occasionally they would go and forbid Muharram processions and this and that, whatever, but generally they were not. And the other vying groups like the Mamluks and so on were also quite threatening to them. Also, because of the pressure from the Safavids at one time and then Nadir Shah and others, a threat of invasion and so on, they reached accommodations with the Persians in terms of not taxing the Persians, in terms of not doing anything silly and so on and so forth. So there was a kind of, if you like, balance of blackmail on both sides. Say, okay, just leave them, otherwise this will happen, or this will happen, or this will happen. And it continued. Now, in this midst, we had the rise of Wahhabism in Arabia. And those, very much like what we see in ISIS today, they just spread like wildfire in that day. And in fact, they put the fear of God into the ulama of the Atabat, or Najaf and Karbala, when in 1801, they actually attacked the shrines and nearly destroyed them. Later on, they attacked again. And this created panic. That, look, if this can happen, then we'll be wiped out, because there wasn't any support structure. Fortunately for them, now I don't know whether this is by design or coincidence. What happened is that these monies which were coming from India, and some of the mujtahids who were linked to that place started to write to the Nawabs to say that of course, these monies are coming, and mostly they were sending monies for the upkeep of the Indian students. I think they look after the Indian students, their Shahriya, this, that, all kinds of things. So we need money for other things. And one of the things they asked for is, firstly, dredging of the canals. Because if you know, both these cities are in the, banks of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. And it is the rivers which provide irrigation and water for these things. And today also we see that the challenge comes from control of dams further up from the Turkish border, which can dictate the fate of these cities. And in times of drought, for long periods, these cities, these rivers will dry out, one of them. And then the whole city will go down. So, for example, once during a drought, Kerbala went down, and Hilla, which was on the other side, became prosperous. Then Hilla became quite important as a center of learning. So you have Allama Hilli and other people who come up from there. So it was really driven by question of how much water, and especially in Najaf and Kerbala to some extent, by diverting the other river, you could keep the water flowing. And this is what the ulama asked the Indian Nawabs to fund a new canal. Even today, that canal is called Nahr al-Hindiya, the Indian canal. It was funded by that money. It took 15 years to dig and then dredge it again. What it did, and it's very interesting, now this is what I'm saying, I don't know whether it is by design or default. It allowed the nomadic people, tribes of that area to settle down. Because if you have constant supply of water and you have agriculture, you don't need to be nomadic, you can settle down. And with these settled people, there was a concerted drive to convert them to Shiism. And this is late in 19th century. Before that, Iraqi Shiism was very small phenomena. Karbala dominated by Persian influences, Najaf by Arab, and Hilla and few places, and Baghdad by some commercial places, but not much more than that. Here, you had large-scale conversion in the south. This provided a protective shield against any further Wahhabi attacks, because now your whole place is surrounded by people who are sympathetic to the shrines. And that's why, as I said, by design or default, the Wahhabi attacks provided a spur for building something which ultimately resulted in Iraq itself becoming a majority Shi'i country. Before it was not a majority Shi'i country. And the Ottomans, who had also helped in dredging one or two canals, from time to time understood that what was happening and they stopped. But because of this independence, it was possible to continue with the work without that. We don't have time to go into the logistics and politics of the transfer of this money from India to the shrines and so on. But just estimate that at one point, 25% plus of the income of those mujtahideen were coming from India. Can you imagine the Safavi bequests? The Iranian monies coming, and then this. So this was even, at that time, 25% of the lot. It's quite important. And in a sense, it's settled. But you see, when these tribes converted to Shiism, this is something we want to see tomorrow again, they brought a different culture of Shiism, different practice, different rituals, different understanding of Shiism than the urban and the more sort of polished, if you like, settled communities of Najaf, Karbala, and Safavi times had become. These people were just tribal. And you see, you can see the difference. Recently, about 6 months ago, I think last Muharram, so about a year now, nearly, there was in the south, where obviously a lot of foreign companies are prospecting for oil, or participating in the extraction of oil and so on. And in this culture, it is very oriented towards ideas of sainthood and sacred personalities and so on. And in both parts of Iran and in Iraq, you find ubiquitous photographs purporting to depict Imam Ali alayhi salam, Imam Hussein, and so on. Typically somebody with a turban and beard, but this is like a symbol of Shiism. And in one of these, in Basra, I think, one of the American contractors or Malaysian contractors, I don't know which one, were disrespectful to one flag which was in one car driven by one of these ex-tribal people. And there was a riot. You cannot touch these things, just leave it. So you see this, we'll see tomorrow how these different attitudes and then built into the practice of Shiism in that area changed as the Iraqi composition of the Iraqi Shiis changed altogether. Okay, so Iraq, which as we saw originated as the birthplace of the partisans of Imam Ali alayhi salam in Kufa after the transfer of the seat of power from Medina to Kufa in Imam Ali's time. That became the seat, and then we see in Kerbala, in everywhere else, that the support base, however fickle, was always coming from Kufa, or the Tawabun, or Mukhtar, or whatever. And then it's people from here who went to other places to spread. But it was very much a small-scale presence in that place. The large-scale conversion came only maybe 100, 150 years ago, not before. Before that, it was very much a small scale. Now that Iraq has become a majority Shia place, and this is one of the problems, because the original Iraqi people still haven't reconciled themselves that the whole thing under their feet has changed. Because see, tribal behavior, whether you are Shia or Sunni, is not that much different, apart from some particular rituals. And this is one of the psychological problems with the problem in Iraq at the moment, okay? Now, in this period after Safavis, just to finish for today and set the scene for tomorrow, this model of state power or legitimizing a non-imam or a legitimate representative as a legitimate ruler and reading Jummah prayers in his name collapsed because the Safavi state went. Only in India there was this pretense, but as I said, even there they referred back to the key mujtahids. Although they read the Jummah prayer in the name of the... So they made a compromise there. Now the question went back again. We saw the day before, we saw the lecture before yesterday. What happens to the rule in the absence of the imam? Do the ulama, scholars, even they be usuli scholars, revert back to the role of being the moral compass of the ummah? Or is it something more? This position is challenged over and over. And one of the key incidents, if you like, which put this to test is an interesting one. For a period, in Qajar period, just a lot of problems. But the ulama acted as a moral conscience of the society. And they relied on private contributions to build the seminaries and knowledge base and so on. But at one point in time, the Nasiruddin Shah, who was a Qajar ruler, started to become very, very stretched financially. And he, of course, being thought himself as a great king, wanted to make a visit to England to visit Queen Victoria. In those days, a visit like that was like costly business, right? You bring a few thousand people and gifts and this and that and all kinds of things. And he didn't know how to finance this business. So he started to approach, and by that time, of course, the British had started to enter into Ottoman Turkey and started to extract a lot of concessions from them in return for financial help, which is generally termed as capitulation. And so Nasiruddin approached one of these, a man called Baron Reuter. This is the same Reuter as this Reuters news agency, right? Founder of that. And he said, look, we need this money. Can we find some way to get this money? I said, yeah, of course, Your Majesty, we can. It's no problem. If you give us the monopoly of tobacco trade, we will advance you that money. If you pay back, we give you the monopoly back. If you don't, we keep the monopoly. Simple. This kind of news spread. And one person in particular, now commonly known as Jamaluddin Afghani, who was a student in Iraq at that time, the Talib Ilm, and who was quite far-sighted, and we'll see some of his ideas tomorrow because that brings us to our discourse between the different parts of the Muslim community. He wrote to Ayatollah Shirazi. Ayatollah Shirazi at that time had migrated from Kerbala to Samarra and had set up his seminary in Samarra. Samarra being a predominantly Sunni, strongly Sunni place, but Samarra also being the place of the burial of the 11th Imam and the house of the 12th Imam and so on. And even today you know that first place to be bombed in the last 10 years was Samarra, the shrine in Samarra. That this is going to compromise the independence of the Muslims. This is what he wrote to Ayatollah Shirazi and, of course, Ayatollah Tehrani and others in Iran as well. Now here the ulama are being asked to take their position further than just a moral compass. Yeah, they want to say proactive. To his credit and whatever, Ayatollah Shirazi said this is something which we cannot shirk away from. We cannot say, oh, okay, it's Allah's will and this is a big danger. So collectively, and particularly him because he was the leading mujtahid, they issued a fatwa. Of course, they could not make smoking haram. All of them were smoking and smoked for another 50 years or more. So they issued a very interesting fatwa. And this shows you the power of usuli thinking as well, right? They said that consumption of tobacco at this time is against the wishes of the 12th Imam. It's not haram, but it is haram. And it is said, I don't know how true it is, that even the family of the Shah himself stopped smoking. And obviously the whole tobacco market started to look like collapsing and the concession was revoked. So this is the first instance of the ulama now figuring out a second kind of strategy after the Safawi experience with the state as to how to exercise this responsibility on themselves. And later on, of course, there are other issues which we'll look at tomorrow, but we want to set this scene that all these upheavals, behind all these upheavals, is also a development of theology going on as to how far the ulama can go to develop this message. And one of the issues is that then where do we position the legacy of Karbala in these developments? So inshallah tomorrow we try to round up all these issues and bring some kind of closure to the discussion. Assalamu alaikum.
We have time for questions from either side. Start from the sister side. Otherwise, the brother side. From my side, how does obviously one of the big problems that you identified was the fact that more of the Shias in India were becoming very sectarian in the way that they were speaking, and that led to a lot of the processions being bombed or attacked in those days. At what stage did the idea of violence to respond to words happen? So the fact that some people are saying things which are very bad is unacceptable in every way, but that doesn't ever excuse violence to respond to it. So when did this, was it always the case that if someone said something bad that resulted in violence coming out?
So it's, I mean, those of you who are familiar, it's very much like the Orange Order processions in Ireland, right? What they try to do is to go to staunch Catholic areas, right? Not in their own areas, and try to push this idea through. And obviously that will result in violence, as it did, and it does still in Ireland. So here also they would target a staunchly Sunni area and say we want to pass through this area, and also swear at this and that. So this is really provocation of a very, very, very sort of dangerous kind. And easily, I mean, obviously I'm sure if somebody passes through this place now swearing at the imams, anything can happen, right? It's not something you just sit and tolerate and say, fine, thank you, go. No, there's a very good question. She's asking about were they linked with the, actually it is called Hashashin, right? Hashashin technically comes from the word hashish. And so it is said that there were a number of people who were so drugged and sent to assassinate a number of leaders, right? But they were not in India or something. They were mostly in the northern parts of Iran, Central Asia, and so on. There's a lot of controversy about their origin and so on. But yes, they did target a number of people they did not like and kill them or assassinate them. Yes, but that's a much more different phenomena than this.
But they did originate from Iran, right?
Oh yes, yes, yeah. But they didn't come to India. No, I don't think they. No, this was mainstream Safavi discourse actually, which in order to really impress Shiism on Iran, they developed these extreme forms, as I said yesterday, of distortion, which was then became quite embedded in the society.
Thank you. It seems like Iraq was the central point of the Shia world at that time, was there ever any relations between the Shia community in India and Shia communities in Arabia, or Shia communities in Iran, or Shia communities elsewhere in the world? And then as a second point following that, was there ever the thought or the development of Marjia from India rather than just following Marjia in Iraq?
Yes, both are interesting questions, right? The link with Iran, as I said, was through trade, and then lay kind of traders who had some knowledge becoming small-time alims and so on. But then the formal link came when they started to send students to Najaf and Kerbala. But again, in Kerbala, mostly to Iranian mujtahids. So they went back with a lot of the Iranian version of things, right? So that was the link. Not much of a link with Arabia or the Arab parts, if you like, on that side. Later on, there will be link with the Fatimids and the Iranians, Aga Khanis, who came to India, but it's small scale. Okay. Your second question is very interesting. Because a number of these top students, very clever students from India, who were in Najaf and Kerbala, wanted to qualify and go back as mujtahids or even marja. There's a lot of evidence to say that both the Iraqi and the Iranian scholars considered the Indians not to be worthy of this job and wouldn't allow them. Some of them who stayed put there are now have risen to that rank. Yeah, for example, I think Ayatollah Fayyaz is from Afghanistan or that area. There's another one who is from India, but you had to stay put there for generations. You know, go back. For what reason? I mean, there is an element of perception and all kinds of other things there, but it didn't happen. They were still, and if you look at the letters between them, you see them, those people are trying to refer to these people as equals, and the reply comes trying to show them as not equals, just below. So in a very subtle kind of address, you can discern that there is a asymmetry between knowledge and perception. So ultimately, no, they didn't allow them to emerge.
Any final questions from either side?
Okay, so we see theological distortions happening because of the social and political environment changing and becoming entangled. Do we see the same happening when it comes to Imami fiqh? Like, so we have adhan, for example.
Do we have what?
We have the adhan, like
Yes.
the reactionary measures in adhan, for example. Do we see other instances of that happening as time continues to progress?
Yes, we want to dig out a few of these tomorrow, but lots of them happening, and lots of them even coming from indigenous cultures and then being accepted as the norm. Yeah. So, for example, to give you an example, when I came to this country first time, and obviously in East Africa, we used to what I would term a very Persian-oriented salam. Yeah, there is, if you know, there is a separate one from Imam Rida, for Imam Rida. Yeah, all the others are in one, and then a separate one for the 12th Imam. If you go to the Iraqi centers here, they don't have a separate one for Imam Rida. They have one across. I asked some Iraqis, he said, no, that one is Iranian. This is ours. So, I mean, while there's nothing wrong in what's happening there, you can see how the thing will change depending on where your focus is. Yeah, Iran, of course, Imam Rida is quite an important shrine because that's the only Imam there, and so there's a lot of importance given to that. To some extent, obviously, there is a question of direction because One is, if you are in Iran, to your right, and all the others are in the left. So you could separate them. But the cultural nuance comes there, right? Similarly, in India, a lot of the mystical traditions were incorporated into the conception of what the Imam is and what the knowledge is. A lot of the ways of commemorating Muharram actually originate in the kind of folk rituals for harvesting rituals, other folk rituals, and so on, and then they are transferred. Nothing wrong in that, but you can see that that's where it comes from, right? And then they are superimposed by other which they think are also sacred because they've come from Iran or Najaf or Kerbala or so on. So tomorrow we'll see a little bit of that, but yes, there is a lot. That's why I'm saying that the conversion of the Arab tribes into Shiism created a lot of havoc because they don't believe in all these things. They have their own different way of practicing.
What about the action taken between the Sunni and the Shia between themselves? So, for example, I don't know, maybe Toba could be an example. I'm not sure if it is, but example of daily life.
Yeah, he said, what about daily discourse between Sunnis and Shias in India, you're asking? Well, Safavi Iran was finished, yeah, because the whole thing became more or less Shi'i, so there's no discourse. Iraq was also nearly separated, so apart from Baghdad, there wasn't that much mixing, if you like, yeah. India, yes, as I said, especially Mughal India, and obviously the majority being Sunnis, they had to find a way to communicate which would keep the peace. So a lot of the Akhbari scholars in India, before the Usulis sort of became dominant, used to prefer the example of Zaid bin Ali, as I said 2 days ago. And this is the founder of the Zaidi school. He's a son of Imam Zainul Abidin, who said, we are not have anything against the first two caliphs because they did not fight or kill the imams. We have a problem with Muawiyah and others. So he said, so if you go that way, you can see there's not that much which can create headache. Yeah? And they preferred that until these usulis came, and some of them made it mandatory to curse everybody. So yes, that has been there.
As opposed to Shiism in India during, for example, Aurangzeb's time. How did it fare and how were they persecuted or targeted is my question.
So, as I hinted, it depends on what the emperor needs. Right? So, Akbar Akbar was quite versatile in his ideology, right? You know that he, for example, founded what came to be later known as Deen-e-Ilahi, when he brought the Christians and the Jews and the Buddhists and the Hindus and Muslims and created a 5-seat throne. You go to Fatehpur Sikri, you can still see it, where all the 5 used to sit and debate and create their own. Akbar also came up with this very interesting idea, primarily because he wanted to marry a Hindu woman, right? Now, obviously, to marry a kafir was a problem. So he came up with this very interesting idea that, look, only 25 prophets are mentioned in the Quran. But Allah says we have sent thousands of prophets, tens of thousands of prophets. So prophets must have come to here. And these people are also Ahlul Kitab, so we can marry them. So you can see the bent of mind of Akbar. And he was able to employ quite a number of very skilled Shi'is in his administration, including appoint some judges and so on. So Akbar's time was okay, if you like. Apart from if he felt threatened in some place, he would crack down there, but not at the center. Babur was slightly worse. Taimur was okay because he needed help from the Safavis or post-Safavis against Afghans. It's Aurangzeb who became tough. Now, it's Aurangzeb's time which started this wave of neo-Salafism, if you like, in India. People started to go to him and said, look, we can't tolerate all this. First they said all this nonsense, yeah? For example, if you go today to the shrine of Khwaja Muinuddin Chishti, who is one of the big Sufi saints of India, you see that about 60% of the people coming there are Hindus. And they are doing everything we do in terms of ziyarat and so on, right? So there was an appeal beyond practicing Muslims, if you like, yeah, or people who were attached. Or you see, typically in India, you also had lots of Hindus joining the Muharram processions and so on. So this was all. But the advisors to Aurangzeb said that this syncretic behavior is dangerous. It dilutes Islam. You must either take them out or fight them. So he started with the Marathas and the Hindus and the Buddhists, and then came to Shi'is as well, and finished them. Now, so Aurangzeb's time was in many senses quite difficult, but at the same time, that critically weakened the Mughal Empire itself, because it lost its, and then it was only a matter of time before the British could push it out.
Was Aurangzeb by any chance influenced by the rise of Salafism in Saudi at all?
Not Saudi. It was an indigenous Indian thing, yeah?
Thank you. Unless any further questions, I think we'll end there. Salawat.